good to have old friends? And isn't it good to make new friends? Valerie Hannon, David Price, two of the top thought leaders in education today, talking to a bloke with a beard and an art teacher. Thought leadership, what does that mean? It might mean something about the formation of compelling ideas that are based on a deep and profound knowledge that's grounded in practice and inspired by purpose that shapes the way other people learn, live, lead and work. There's nobody in the world of education and nobody in the world of educational thought leadership who's more qualified to talk about these things than Valerie Hannon and David Price, Adriano. I am so excited. We get to talk with both of them at once. Let's go.
Phil, it is so wonderful to be with you again, and I'm gonna bypass the banter and the begrudging words that I often have for the second best city in Australia, Sydney, because I can't wait to get into this conversation with our two glorious guests. David, I'm going to start with you, and our listeners have had the great fortune of encountering Valerie before, and as I said to you offline a moment ago, Valerie's episode is one of our highest ever listened to episodes. So no pressure on you, my friend, as we start with the very first question, and that is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've gotten to where you are today?
Oh God, well, that's the whole program gone right there. The massively truncated version, because Valerie's sick to death of hearing this story. So I grew up in the northeast of England, very deprived working class area. Although young people find it hard to believe, but when I grew up in the 70s, there was full employment. It wasn't a case of, whether you'd find a job, it was just what kind of a job. And I remember vividly telling my careers advisor that I wanted to be a professional musician. And he's probably still laughing to this day. But I ended up doing that for about 15 years and then just drifted into education because I was that kid at school who hated being there, just wanted to get away. And the day I left school, I thought, I'm never going back there again. And 30 years later, when I was doing some freelance work, Ken Robinson got me a job at that school, a consultancy, and I had to go back to my old grammar school. It was the most terrifying day of my life. But yeah, I've never had such a thing as a career plan. Worked in originally community education, then adult education. Like Valerie, I spent quite a while in further education. And then in higher ed, helped establish the Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts with Paul McCartney, and Ken Robinson was our chief external examiner. And then just been doing freelance work since then, which is how I came to start working with Valerie at the innovation unit. And then more latterly started writing books and talking. That's it.
You're involved in quite a lot of things at the moment, David, and of course, we know so much about what you've recently launched in relation to your book. Can you share with our listeners about one project that you're currently engaged in that has the potential to be a real game changer in creating today's learning for tomorrow's world?
Well, currently, because of lockdown, my life is split into obviously promoting the book, giving talks around the book. I'm doing quite a bit, with schools, and it being the relatively early in one academic year in the Northern Hemisphere and coming to the end of another in the Southern Hemisphere. And then the other thing that I've had to shift over to is me and my wife train teachers in project-based learning. So for me, it was a case of, and I've spoken to Valerie about this, I think we both feel the same way, that the work that we were doing at the innovation unit was kind of looking at system level change and, the change that you hope filters down. But I found that personally unsatisfying without some bottom up stuff. And I've always enjoyed training. So we started going to Australia, was 12 years ago, me and my wife. And we've been going there twice a year ever since up until March. And Valerie and I were also doing some workshops around leadership. We've combined our two books together, our last two books, and do some leadership training around that. So it's a complete mix of things, really.
Valerie, I might turn to you now really quickly and ask you the same type of question. I know that you're currently involved in quite a lot of things as well, particularly, of course, with the Innovation Unit in the UK. But what is a project that you're currently engaged in that, again, has the potential to be a serious game changer in our climate today, in really crafting today's learning for tomorrow's world for today?
Well, thanks, Adriano. There's two parts to my view of what might bring about change. One is a different narrative, a different discussion, a different level of conversation about what education is and what it's for. And I do think COVID kind of gives us a bit of an option, a bit of a possibility to change the terms of that debate. And we've got to change the terms of that debate, because if we carry on with all the implicit assumptions about what success is, what schooling is for, how higher education is structured and how it relates to vocational education, in technical terms, we're stuffed. So I continue to try to find ways to work with people who are engaged in changing the conversation. So the second part of it, my theory of change, if you like, which is what I talked about in the RELEARN Festival, is how do you get as many examples of great new practice, the kinds of schools who are working with David Price on putting project-based learning into practice. How do you get as many examples of that under the spotlight and show how fantastic this experience can be for young people? So the latest thing I've been doing is writing a new book called The Future School. This was to have been the Australian Learning Lecture in March. Didn't happen, obviously. Yeah. But I've just recorded a video for the Australian Learning Lecture, which is a shortened version of that, which completely puts the spotlight on some superb examples around the world. In that, I try to make an argument about what the future school might and should look like. That goes into then thinking about future-focused design principles, which you need some guide rails. You need some way in which to navigate what you're about, and some principles for doing that. So my research has looked at worldwide where they've come from, and a whole series of future-focused organizations have been involved in that. And then I've looked at clusters of schools who are putting these design principles into practice in the real world with, I think, outstanding results. So I think putting the spotlight on them and showing, you know what, things do not go to hell when you really instantiate these design principles in a full-hearted way. So those are the two parts of the equation, I guess.
Thanks for that, Valerie, and thanks for that, David. I know from the conversation that as it's emerging now, and also our previous conversation with Valerie, and I know from my conversations with Adriano too, that we've got 4 people in a conversation here who are driven much less by having a plan as they are by having a purpose. Can I ask both of you, perhaps Valerie first and then David, when did you first become aware of what the driving purpose of your life was going to be? And what was it at that point?
Well, I think I've got to raise here the spectre, the ghost of our dearly departed friend, Ken Robinson, actually. And, it wouldn't be right to have this conversation, by the way, not to mention him and his tragic death this year. I was a kind of high-level bureaucrat, if you like, in the system here in the UK, struggling with the usual systems maintenance problems. Not enough money, crumbling school buildings, teachers with far too much to do and the wrong things to do. Head teachers caught in an ideological battleground in a political context where the government wanted to smash local authorities, allegedly drive power down to the schools, but actually, in reality, sucking it into the centre. So I was completely preoccupied with all of that. And that job as a director of education, a DG in Australian terms, had just been kind of like the next thing on the conveyor belt of promotion and, trying to do a more senior and more important job. And then I met Ken Robinson fairly late on, and for some reason he was kind enough to kind of explore what I was trying to do up here in Derbyshire and involve me in the creativity committee. And I do think that point was one of those sort of turning points in my life, really, because I sort of stood back and looked at some of the good things I've been trying to do in my existing job, and they were at the margins. They weren't the main deal, you know. And also the heart of the matter, which Ken, of course, brought to public attention, which is, where is human creativity and imagination in everything that we're doing in schools? And I honestly think that for the first time in my life, I really sat back and thought, what in God's name am I doing? And as a result of that, I basically resigned from that job. After the report, All Our Futures on Creativity was released. And I thought, you know, maybe there's other ways that I can contribute. I wasn't sure there would be. I'd published a bit, but not very much. And it was a bit of a leap in the dark. And, you know, very happily, some friends kind of said, well, let's try this, let's try that. And then, as to use David's terms, kind of discovered the power of us. Because out of that, we decided to set up an innovation unit, a social enterprise, you know, trying to do stuff in this space. But I think if it hadn't been for Ken, well, I don't know what would have become a nervous breakdown probably. But that was a genuine turning point, and that's authentic. I'm not just making that up; it's really true.
Really appreciate that, Valerie. What about you, David?
Well, that's really odd, because I'm about to say exactly the same thing, and it was Ken. And I suspect, I took part earlier this week in a kind of tribute to Ken, and I suspect there'd probably be 10,000 people around the world who would give exactly the same response. But with Ken, it was, I'd spent all my life in arts education, you know, and I knew that was dear to Ken's heart. And through the working at the Liverpool Institute, we'd spent a lot of time together. But he was at that point where, you know, his star was rising. He'd just left Warwick University. And he asked me across to a weekend event on Paul Allen's private island, Paul Allen of Microsoft. And it was a bizarre, surreal weekend that I spent the entire time with food poisoning, thrown up on Paul Allen's very expensive floors. But in between those bouts of sickness, I had a couple of conversations with Ken where he kind of convinced me, because, you know, coming from the working class background, you've always got the imposter syndrome. And I always thought I could only work in arts education. And it was Ken who said, no, of course not. It's ridiculous. And I remember vividly, I stayed with my father, who never quite understood what I did for a living. And he said, so what are you doing up here? I said, I'm here to look at the idea of putting together a super school. And he said, what, it's about music? And I said, no. He said, what, drama? I said, no. I said, it's a school. And we're looking to do and put a new school together. And he looked at me and he said, what the hell do you know about geography? And I thought, yeah, actually, I don't know anything about geography, but that doesn't matter, because in my head, I realized that what I was passionate about, the thing that drove me was to, I guess, without feeling sorry for myself, was to make sure as few as young people as possible had the kind of dreary existence that I had in school. So for me, it then became about engagement. And that's when I first started working with Valerie. And we spent maybe 10 years, Valerie, I guess, looking at student engagement in various projects around the world. And yeah, that was that shift in purpose, that actually I could have a bigger impact and work with more people if I broadened my own horizons and just believed a little bit more in myself.
It's very, very interesting stories that you tell there, and of course it's the same person who's inspired you, and what a person to come into your lives and help you think like that. So much of the work that we're doing at the moment with educators around the world convinces us that it's their sense of purpose that makes a difference in them going from doing the stuff of education to doing something doing something that's quite remarkable in making a difference in people's lives. There are very few people, I think, who go into teaching to do stuff. Lots of them, we think, start with this sort of fairly inchoate thing that they want to help or make a difference, and then it refines and shapes into a purpose. And too often, or so often, it's a process of apprenticeship. It's what we would call a character apprenticeship, where somebody connects and helps somebody make that big step forward and up in their thinking about what they can do in education. How is it, do you think, that we can help schools and school systems to give teachers the time to connect with each other in those sorts of meaningful relationships that help them find that sense of purpose to go on and really make a difference.
Who gets to go?
You can go ahead, Valerie.
I think you should go, Valerie.
Well, I will, because what I'm immediately reminded of actually is the last sequence of workshops that Dave and I did together. And it was Dave's idea to start them off. I mean, maybe some of the people watching this will have been part of it and they might have a comment to make. But we started off by getting people to kind of line themselves up in the room in terms of how long they've been in the profession, but then also to think about the kinds of things that brought them into the profession. And the distance traveled I won't go into it, but it was getting to this point exactly, Phil, which was, what was your driving idea or motivation of coming into this profession? And by the way, you've got to hold open the possibility that, as in my case, some people drifted in for lack of bloody idea of anything else to do.
Exactly.
So it's not all very high kind of, high-minded purpose about this. Some people have, and you say it could be an inchoate idea about making a difference, but some people it hasn't been that. But I have found that quite often at the first engagement with the enemy, namely getting really up close with young people, quite often that can change very fast, and they do achieve or acquire a really powerful driving sense of purpose, and then quite often get very frustrated because what they're able to do in their context is nowhere near what they feel needs to be done. So, but working on our experience, I would say that the most important thing that school leaders and schools can do is make time to elevate adult learning, the professional learning of your staff, and a really high priority. And give them time within that, not to do quotes training, which is just technical information transfer, but to be reflective, to be really reflective on what it is that their institution is trying to do as a whole and their contribution to that, and where they might be taking that in the next 3-5 years. So making reflection, personal development, professional growth, as well as the kind of more technical aspects of teaching, a very high priority is for me a critical thing that every school leader can do. I mean, they really can. And that is about how you order your priorities.
Yeah, you don't need more time and you don't need more money to do that. You just need to make a choice about what's really important, don't you?
I agree.
David, what about you? What are your thoughts on how we can create those moments where people can reflect on practice and find that thing, that passion?
Well, so I've written a book, and within the book, one of the things I try to highlight is it's not exclusive to education. It's like all of the really innovative organizations that I studied had a number of things in common. They were very values driven. They had very high levels of trust, but they believed in the centrality of learning to their mission. And I don't care whether that's selling, cans of WD-40 or craft beer up in Brewdog in Scotland, or the kind of amazing schools that I also include in the book. But I sometimes get into trouble for saying this, but actually schools and colleges aren't very good at learning, which is, it's kind of counterintuitive. But in terms of building an internal learning culture, and it's partly because we know how busy they all are, but it actually being intentional about creating the time and space for those kinds of conversations is really essential if you want to be an innovative school. If you just want to keep doing the same old things, well, it doesn't really matter. But I think two things have changed in the past 10 years, which have really transformed the picture, it seems to me. One is that, Valerie and I are very all around the world, but actually you don't need to travel all around the world now to be globally networked. We see it all the time on social media. Teachers are in touch with other teachers all around the world. Why does that matter? Well, speaking from the highly insular, not to say myopic UK, we tend to think that all the good ideas stop at the Irish Sea. And actually, it's important, I find, for teachers to recognize that there are big changes happening in education. Might not be in England right now, but they're happening around the world. I think the second thing, which is transforming it and is that students are also networking, and students are coming together internationally to work on projects. And personally, I find that incredibly exciting. I think it should be the job of schools to help facilitate it, but it's going to happen anyway. And I think how we actually enable that and facilitate those kinds of conversations so that these young people can be genuine change makers internationally is the thing that drives me and will continue to drive me.
One of the really interesting things, thank you for that, David. One of the most interesting things we have witnessed here, particularly in Victoria, there isn't many regions in the world that have been in a sustained kind of lockdown period for the length of time that we have been here in Victoria, over 100+ days. So much of that required all education systems in this state, the Catholic, the independent, the public, to pivot to a completely new delivery model, something that was so foreign to many of them. Sure, there were schools that are very well established with the use of technology and strong LMSs, but in many ways, COVID-19 provided us with this kind of true awakening. And from that, what the schools that we've been working with and what we have witnessed from that is clearly many outcomes. Yes, we've seen issues around the digital divide, and one of the real pandemics, of course, is this notion of inequity and access to technology and bandwidth and so on. We've also seen, though, how a system was able to pivot because they had to, with little red tape, not too much contemplation and procrastination, and simply getting on with it. And some of the learnings that we gained from that was that the first was that well-being has to be central to every single model, and that we really have to focus our strong attention to emotional competency being the new knowledge base. The second was, how do we continue to leverage community? Because ultimately that's the power and the strength of schools, through the character apprenticeship between the teacher and the student, through the social exchange that happens between their peers and each other, and so on. And of course, extending beyond the boundaries of the school in their local and global communities. And so young people are learning in context, they're learning in country, and so on. But the third one that was the most interesting was moving to a learning agility that was around mixing it up, where it was clear that time now became fluid. And it was very different to the structure of, say, a 10-day timetable, with bums on seats at a set time. Now, some schools went down that path. Some even primary schools insisted on their primary school children to sit in front of a screen for 6 hours a day, which is astronomical. However, the schools that were really successful realized that this was no longer about migrating schooling in a physical context to an online continuous learning paradigm, because they understood now that time mattered differently. And they were brave enough to allow young people the opportunity for self-paced, self-determined learning, where the control of the teacher was more around coach facilitator and co-creating the knowledge and the skills and the outcomes with these young people, because in some ways that was the best way in which to continue to engage students. I'm sharing all this with you because these are some of our initial findings so far here in Victoria with what we have witnessed. And even there are some schools who are wanting to continue down this path going forward, which we're really excited about what that possibility looks like. My question to both of you is, does COVID-19 now present us with the crucible moment, the educational spring, the transformation in education that Sir Ken had been agitating for 13 years and more? Is this now finally the moment of the awakening, or are we going to see us running back to a status quo that continues to not serve us well?
Well, I think in many contexts, yes, the latter will arrive, because we have not changed the terms of the political debate. And we cannot leave politics out of this. The whole regulatory framework, the public discourse about what matters, access to university as though that's the be all and bloody end all, and as though a university degree is the, you know, the guarantee of a happy, of a thriving life. As long as those pieces stay in place, then all the old assumptions will sort of creep back in, and there will be a snapback. And by the way, Phil, you shouldn't, and Adriano, you shouldn't, I think, underestimate the extent to which, God knows, in your context, wouldn't you know this, people want their old lives back.
Sure.
Bring it back. You know, let me get back to what I knew. I missed it so badly. So that's one point. There's a huge danger that it will snap back. And I think that unless we agitate strongly amongst a new generation of politicians to start a different kind of conversation, then there will be a snapback. That's point one. Point two, in relation to what you said, I think we've got to be very careful, and you were careful in what you said, about understanding the imperative of redesigning the school as a social institution. And in a way, this is a dangerous moment, a moment I feared, that it's a point where the edtechs can say, stuff schools, at last, deschooling, who needs them? And you see this movement very strongly in the States at the moment, where privileged parents are setting up pandemic pods, you know, bringing in a teacher for 1 or 2 sessions, but using the tech to be the kind of basis of the learning system for their kids. My argument, and this is the argument I'm setting out in my new book on the future school, is that schools are vital for the future of our societies and our planet, actually, as social institutions where people come together physically, in community, eyeball to eyeball, meet people from different social stratospheres, and work together on things that matter. So the reinvention of the school as a social institution, for me, is absolutely the center of what we need to be doing. And we need some help in terms of, you know, what guides that redesign. You mentioned time. In my thinking, there are kind of 5 pillars, really. It's time, it's people, it's place and space, it's technology, and it's partnerships. Now, all of those are kind of concretized at the moment for the school as we know it, and they all need to change. And time has been the one that's been messed with most helpfully in this period, but the other 4 need to be as well. So the question in my thinking is, what kind of guardrails or guidelines or yes, principles are there to help people think about how you change those variables? And that's where a set of design principles I've tried to bring together from across the world seem to me to provide a kind of framework that helps you make it right for your context, because it's going to be very contextually specific and distinctive. And diversity is to be absolutely welcomed and celebrated now, I think.
Yeah. David, I might follow it up with what Valerie just said there and ask you this question. How then do we create a human-centered approach to foster the conditions for students' character, competency, and wellness to kind of really flourish, and so that help each young person to really unlock their inherent possibility in the world and the paradigm that Valerie now has just described to us? Because what we are witnessing is that human-centered, purpose-driven, tech-augmented has a real place in this kind of new world. But we have to keep embracing the knowledge that we are in the age of the human.
Before I get into answering that, Adriano, can I just ask you, you talked about the 3 things that you'd learned in Victoria. Who's the we that you're talking about? Is it teachers that you're speaking to, or is it departments within government?
Never departments, David. We talk with chalkies, because, you know, we talk with chalkies and we talk with leaders on the ground. Our whole research base is grounded in schools and the lived experience of them. We're very, very aware of talking to bureaucrats, you know.
You see that right there, that's the problem.
Yeah.
There's this divide, there's the bureaucrats,
yeah,
you know, the mindless automata who carry on with this. And I just don't think that we can have the luxury of saying, you know what, we're just going to do with the grassroots and get on with it here. because so
Yeah.
much flows from that utilization of power. What's the deal
Yeah,
here? You
I-
can't go like that.
No, I think I agree with you, Valerie. I think for our focus with game changers and the school for tomorrow, we've tended to do the grounded piece because there are other people in Australia who are doing terrific work at the policy level, and we just felt that that what was missing in the voice was the voice of practitioners around that to complement that. That's not the case in other jurisdictions around the world, you know. So I think you just find your niche where you are around there. David,
you make your contribution where you can make it.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. You know, you do your thing.
David, also just to answer that question that you asked me there, during the height of the pandemic, where we were required to really pivot, you know, everyone was looking for an answer. You know, they all wanted some miracle way of how we're going to navigate through this, you know. And what we were able to do really quickly was develop a number of toolkits. Not for 1 minute am I suggesting we had all the answers, by the way, but these toolkits highlighted work that we were doing with not only schools here in Victoria, but across the globe around reimagining the use of time and introducing synchronous, asynchronous learning and all types of different paradigms and how it can be online, on campus, in context and in country, this kind of anytime, anywhere concept. And so...
And the podcast too.
Of course, and the podcast conversations. But you know, what we learned really quickly was those schools that had courageous leadership, that were led by teams that simply gave their community permission to trial things. So they basically were leading through crisis as opposed to managing a response, are the ones that discovered their inherent specialness, which what you illustrated, Valerie, that they are social constructs and that the gift of learning communities is this social contract that we enter in with young people in our care and their families, and the preciousness of that. And the ones that really, that became amplified in those who made that central and now want to continue with it because they believe that's their work, that they believe that's the mission, that's the true mission of their work.
And they're right. They're right, but to try to connect the three parts of the discussion that we've just been having there, they're right, but I think they feel like government doesn't get it. They partly don't get it because they're not aware. I mean, you started talking about self-determination theory. You know, there are very few department people who understand what you were talking about. But to me, it's absolutely central to how we go forward now with education. So it's part of a school's job, it seems to me, to be making those arguments. And I think, to go right back to the origin of the question, yes, it is a crucible moment, and it depends upon how we respond to that as schools and as communities, because I keep making the point that what we're seeing, certainly in this country, and I think it's true to say pretty much all around the world as a result of COVID, is that we are going to have some decimated communities economically, socially. So they're really already badly fractured. I think there is a phenomenal opportunity for schools to be right at the heart of restoring that sense of community, which gets right back to the whole purpose part of it. Because so long as schools are just seen as their job is to get these kids through one hoop and through the next one, and then they're off to the next stage of development, then we're missing a trick. And we're not placing them at the heart of community. Natalie C., the principal of Hilltop Road in Sydney, she's always said her job is to build community. And I think that's absolutely right. And it's what more of our schools will need to do. It will take vision to do that with government support. But I think to a certain extent, what you said, Adriano, is correct, that there are already some schools that are saying, well, we're going to do this anyway because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing for our students and it's the right thing for our parents. But I suspect life would be an awful lot simpler if we could get that conversation going. And one of the sadnesses that I had is Valerie and I were involved in an initiative called the Great Big Education Conversation. in the UK, where we were starting to get those kinds of constituents together for a series of face-to-face meetings in rooms where we had parents with business leaders, with communities, with teachers. And of course, COVID put a stop to it. But hopefully when we all start up again, we will start to have those kinds of conversations, because even if it's true, as Grant Lichtman has once said, that, we've kind of got the purpose of schooling pretty much consensual. We certainly haven't in this country, in the UK. But even if that were true, I think what COVID is doing is challenging a lot of that purpose. In a sense, we have to have that purpose discussion all over again.
Yeah, I agree with that. And can I just say, consensual up to a point in those who are really reflective on this, but even between us, and I don't want to do a kind of Palestine Liberation Front versus the Liberation Front for Palestine here, but when I hear human-centered the whole time, there's a bit of me that says, you know what? No, actually, it's got to be planet-centered. This bloody pandemic is not just a one-off. There are going to be more, and they are coming from zoonotic viruses. And they're coming from zoonotic viruses because our relationship with nature is completely out of whack. So the transgression into wild habitats, deforestation, the trade in wild animals, all these things are what has brought about the jumping of viruses from animals to humans. And there are about 700,000 of those viruses out there amongst mammals and other animals. Now, there are people thinking, oh, well, vaccines will do it. No, we've got to go upstream and rethink our relationship with nature. So when you say to me, oh, the purpose is fine, we got that nailed down, I have to say, actually, I don't agree, because I think there is something so fundamental now, apart from being really urgent as far as climate emergency is concerned, but so fundamental in recalibrating our relationship with nature and understanding that we are a fundamental part of it, which is such a big shift, and it's got to be absolutely the center of what we do, that there's still a debate to be had around that, I have to say. I mean, you may disagree with me, but human-centered is a narrowing the vision, which for me won't do.
Well, I suppose it really depends, though, Valerie, on your definition of that, doesn't it? Because I'll just give you one quick example. We have a little exercise that we do every single week with young people, young students. They're 18, they're in their final year of high school, or the first couple of years of university, or their apprenticeship, or whatever they've done post-university, where we invite them to answer a series of Q&A questions. And the answers to their particular questions, what encourages me around, instead of just living in this world, but feeling in this world, is that I'm starting to see more and more a generation that has a deep consciousness, not only about themselves, but about place and the other. And when I mean place, I'm talking about the natural world. And in so many of their responses, these young people who have encounters in schools where they were able to develop empathy, where they were able to be more in touch with their emotional competency, where they were able to be more in tune with intercultural and cultural and social awareness and spiritual awareness and the environmental awareness, they seem to have a deeper consciousness about doing something about what's happening in our planet than generations prior to them. That's a generalization I'm making, but that's what I'm experiencing more and more with these young people who increasingly are becoming more passionate about their world and are wanting a seat at the table, and their voice and agency is definitely being heard and amplified.
Of course, and I get that completely, Adriano, and sometimes, the human-centered approach completely does go down that path, and it's profoundly holistic. With a spiritual dimension to it, but it might not, and I want to inject it into the conversation in its own right.
Go for it. I love it. I love it. David?
So, if most young people listening to what Valerie just said about, animal to human transmission, they'd be nodding their heads in agreement. They know that.
Yeah.
It's the politicians that haven't got that, just like, we've got a 16-year-old Swedish kid who's leading the global debate about the environment, and the politicians signally failing to get it. What I think we need to be doing, though, is to make sure that that's at the core of their education, and not something that they get into in debating clubs outside of school.
David and Valerie, it's such a treat listening to this conversation, and Adriano too. 3 really powerful thought leaders and 3 really interesting thinkers. And what you've been taking us through is a little bit of a journey in all sorts of critical competencies for our time and for tomorrow. I'm going to start, Valerie, with your point about the world and the planet and sustainability, because for the life of me, you know, we can get our own house in order, but if we can't sort out our relationship with the planet, what's the point?
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the divergent thinking that's been exemplified so far. I'm really interested, and we probably won't have time to talk about it too much now, but I'd love to know more about your actual collaboration and how you're collaborating. But certainly we're talking a lot about collaboration. We're talking about the courage of leadership in our times. There's so much here that we know. You know, Pfeffer and Sutton, when they wrote their book on the knowing doing gap 20 years ago now, sort of, you know, they did the classic piece. You know, I was 30 when that came out, and we've still got that knowing doing gap. We talked in our conversation about the challenge of different parts of education not talking with each other properly, and that's been around since probably all of us were wee sprites in education. How do we bridge the knowing doing gap? How do we change the game so that we can achieve some of these amazing outcomes that you guys are writing about and that we're listening to? Maybe David, you might want to kick off.
Well, we've kind of alluded to it, it seems to me, which is that we know that because we've had 30, 40 years of it, certainly in this country, of trying to get policymakers to listen to school leaders. They don't. So, you know, as much as we'll have TV programs about how inspirational these school leaders are, when it comes to developing policy, they're not interested. Conversely, we've got some people who are not involved in the conversation. I'd have to say sometimes I think because we make a false assumption that they're not really interested in talking about, you know, learning theories or knowing doing gaps. And that's parents and increasingly employers. I think one of the things that we've seen is in the degeneration of trust in all of our institutions, the one kind of cluster where trust is starting to rise again is in leaders of organizations, in CEOs. And I think they're also sensing that they have a responsibility above and beyond their shareholders and even the staff that they work in. So I think there is an opportunity, at least now, for us to say, first of all, let's change the language, because we use far too much technical talk, far too much insider talk, which excludes people. But let's start to have a conversation which will look at place-based education, curricula that serves its local communities, and let's try. Valerie alluded to that, you know, Palestinian Liberation Front. We are dreadful. People who are in the broad umbrella of progressive education, we're dreadful at getting together a coherent, aggregated voice, which, were we able to do it, I think people would be astonished at the numbers of people who are basically saying the same thing. But what stops us is that we find little single issues that we disagree with. Meanwhile, the traditional, you know, views, the trads in education have got their argument down pat, and they're much better at getting their argument across. So what I'm saying is, yes, it's hard. The knowing doing gap exists because we're human and we're all fallible. But I think the one thing that we should be doing now beyond COVID is to open up that discussion around the kind of education that our communities need, not just our kids.
Thanks, David. Valerie, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think there've got to be multiple lines of attack, not just one. And I come back to thinking I've been trying to do around what's your theory of change? Who are the key players in all of this? The various, I won't call them stakeholders, but the various parties who've got a part to play. And I just don't think we can carry on not demonizing but caricaturing bureaucrats as lumps of concrete. In my experience, they're not. They're thinking people often with terrific motivation, but with huge constraints. And those constraints fundamentally are political, usually, to do with what politicians second guess the public will tolerate and want. And so that kind of echo chamber about their assumptions about what the public will wear and be prepared to vote for or to accept from them, we've got to work at. So I come back to this point about involving younger politicians in a different kind of conversation, and David's point about giving a different language, a different lexicon, a different kind of discourse is really an important part, I think. And I think that needs to be a really inclusive debate. And I think the other shrewd thing to do is to choose some Trojan horses, some weak points of the system. And here you ask, did COVID help us? I think COVID might, in the context of assessment, which of course has been the huge bottleneck for systems. Yeah. As the filter which determines who will get the rationed social benefits. And so given that assessment's been so disrupted in many areas, and guess what, the world hasn't fallen to pieces, and people are starting to ask, even here, I'm given hope by the fact
it's fabulous, isn't it? Imagine the UK without A-levels and GCSEs for a year.
Well, they're trying to say that they'll carry on as normal next year. It's like King Canute, like, okay, to say there. But there is an interesting grouping here called Rethinking Assessment, and also the work that the Australian Learning Lecture has done in the Australian context, attacking ATAR and thinking about beyond ATAR. And I think that whole debate now is going to get some traction, because people are asking some hard questions about the cost of the existing assessments. I mean, the dollar cost, is absolutely phenomenal. And who gains? Cui bono? Who gets the gain?
And the psychological cost.
And then the psychological cost, Adriano, which is even, well, it's just incalculable.
Yeah.
And for what? And for what? So when you're starting to get alliances of really quite elite schools, as well as schools with, a much more social mission, asking hard questions about this, I think that could be a Trojan horse. And we've got to find more of those to drive a wedge into the existing structure to help us see it crumble.
I'm conscious we're nearly on the hour. I think I would love to keep this going for a long time, because I know that our listeners are going to gain so much from what you are both sharing with us. But I want to finish off with this part sentence, and I'll let you both finish the sentence. And then I'll hand it over to Phil to wrap it up. I might start with you, Valerie. And the sentence is, what our world needs now is.
You could have given me some notice.
I didn't get.
I think I would say a new generation of empowered young people.
David, you're on the spot now, my friend.
Well, you wouldn't expect a songwriter to answer that with anything other than love, sweet love. But since Bert Bacharach and Hal David aren't here, I'd slightly take issue with Valerie on that, because I think we've got that generation. We just need to give them a greater agency. But I honestly do believe that we have a generation of young people who are who've come through now in the past, particularly past 10, 15 years, who aren't any longer content to be bystanders in their own education. And so we've somehow got to find the means to enable them to be active players in the change of education. And that in itself would address some of the issues that we've been talking about today, about the need for, a broader concept of what we mean by planetary education, all of those kinds of things. I think it would happen anyway. But in order to do that, we've got to stop demonizing them and fearing them and start trusting them.
I have a feeling, David, that they're not going to be asking for permission much longer.
No. I agree.
I have a feeling they've already started not asking.
Yeah, that's
wherever
true.
they go.
And all props to them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hey, David and Valerie, thank you so much for the conversation today. It's got everything that you'd really want to send you away to think about all sorts of things. and it goes from the most profound and the contemplation of the planet and the role of children and young people in the world to Monty Python references. So there's a wealth of knowledge in there. For our listeners, if you haven't read Valerie's latest book, Thrive, which is going to be published next year in a second edition by Cummins.
I should say it's not available at the moment, but it will be out in February in a new edition, which will be very much on David's point about agency. So yeah, have a look at that.
Excellent. And her latest book also, Can School Save Us, will appear later in the year. So 2021 is going to be a real good year for you, Valerie. And then David's book, The Power of Us, just been re-released and refreshed and updated in the time. Lots and lots of good reading material there. If there are any principals out there who are thinking about reading guides for their staff right now, you could go a lot worse next year than picking those two books and going for that. Just as long as you get your folk to listen to the Game Changers podcast as well. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us. We really value the time that you've spent with us and the way in which you've contributed to the second serve in the RELEARN Learning Festival. Thank you. The Game Changers podcast is produced by Oliver Cummins for Orbital Productions. It's powered by schoolfortomorrow.com and circle.education. It's available on Apple Podcasts, on SoundCloud, on Spotify and on Google. If you like what you hear, tell your friends, subscribe, like, you know what to do. Let's go.